When we build our systems, we want to give them the highest possible chance of a high uptime and system and hardware redundancy. And one of the things we use for that is RAID. Whenever I have talked to colleagues, they have always referred to it as redundant array of independent disks, but it is possible somewhere you would see it as inexpensive disks. How we would know they're inexpensive, I have no clue. We do know, however, they are independent. RAID comes in two basic forms, disk mirroring and disk striping. Disk mirroring makes sense. We have a mirror of the disk. Write the same data to disk A and to disk B. If disk A fails, we have everything on disk B. But this is also slower because the RAID controller has to write the same data twice. And you can technically put in as many disks in a mirror as you want, but you need at a minimum 2. And if you use 2, you use twice the storage to store the same data. Disk striping is us writing the data across multiple disks. For disk striping, we need at least 2 disks, and it does in itself not provide any redundancy. If you look on the graphic over here on the right at the bottom, you can see that the data is written across 3 disks. If disk C fails, we lose all the data on that disk. We may not be able to restore anything. And while writing faster to a disk is nice, we really want that redundancy. To get that, we use parity with our striping. That adds the redundancy, and we often get that just by XORing. We need at least 3 disks. So let's look at a couple of the different types of RAID you might see in your environment. RAID 0 is striping with no parity. There is no fault tolerance. The graphic over here on the right, you can see we have 2 disks. If one of the disks fails, all that data is lost. Only thing we get out of this is we get faster read and write speeds. For RAID 0, we need at least 2 disks. RAID 1 is the mirroring we talked about before. Write the same data on disk A and disk B. That obviously gives us the redundancy, but it's also much slower. Out in the business world, RAID 0 and RAID 1 are rarely used. We would in many places use RAID 5. That is the one we talked about before, where we had the striping with distributed parity. It needs at least 3 disks. And this is a good combination where we both get the increased write and read speeds, and we also get redundancy. With RAID 5, we are protected against data loss if a single disk fails. But if more than one disk fails, we are just as lost as we would have been if we did not have the redundancy. So as soon as we realize a disk has failed, we replace it. I actually don't recall a server that I've ever worked on where more than one disk failed before we could get the first one replaced. But that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Normally when we buy a physical server, all the disks in there are built at the same time, meaning the MTBF, or the mean time between failure, is pretty much the same. Let's just say, as an example, the mean time between failure for these disks over here on the right is 3 years. In large data centers or in places where what you store on your servers is critical, it is also very common to have a service level agreement with either the vendor that built the system or just someone you buy a service contract from. And as part of that service level agreement, you would have a MTTR, or a mean time to repair. From the time we notify them, either by calling them or them monitoring our systems and see something is failing, they could have 4 or 8 or 12 or 20 hours or whatever for someone to be on site with the replacement disk. One of the data centers I worked at had a pretty aggressive agreement. Within 4 hours, the tech had to be on site. But they did not have all the disks that we needed for our data center. I remember one incident where the technician was there at 3:59. He technically was there before the 4 hours had passed, but he also told me he spent an hour and a half waiting in the airport for the disk to get flown in. In most places, though, they would have spares laying around. But even if you don't have the service level agreement, it is common in most data centers to have backup disks for any system you have in your environment. As soon as a disk fails, or as soon as predicts it's going to fail, we replace the disk.